The barn was already consumed by flames when they dragged Solomon Pierce from his quarters that midnight in 1844, his hands bound with rope that cut into his wrists. Master Beaumont stood there with fury in his eyes, pointing at the inferno that lit up the Louisiana sky like a second sun. Solomon tried to tell them he'd been 3 miles away at the Whitmore plantation delivering grain, but his words fell on ears that didn't want to hear truth. That night, as they locked him in the root cellar to await the sheriff at dawn, something impossible happened. The master's storehouse, the one filled with cotton and tobacco worth more than $50,000, erupted in flames so fierce the heat could be felt a quarter-mile away. When the embers cooled and men walked through the ash-covered floor, they found barefoot prints, fresh prints that belonged to no living soul they could find, prints that led straight to the tree line and then vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Solomon Pierce was gone from that locked cellar, and nobody could explain how. Some said he walked through fire itself to gain his freedom, and in the years that followed, every unexplained blaze in 3 parishes carried whispers of his name. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Solomon Pierce truly begins not with flames but with chains, forged in the dark heart of the American South, where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Solomon had been born in 1818 on the Beaumont plantation, a sprawling estate of 2,000 acres that stretched along the Mississippi River like a serpent basking in the sun. His mother, Constance, had been a house servant who bore him after a union with a field hand named Joseph, a man of quiet dignity who taught his son to read in secret by candlelight, tracing letters in the dirt when no white eyes were watching. This gift of literacy would prove both blessing and curse in the years to come. The Beaumont family had owned this land for 3 generations, building their wealth on the backs of 200 enslaved people who toiled from dawn until dusk under the merciless Louisiana sun. Master Richard Beaumont, the current patriarch, was a man of average height, but considerable girth, with jowls that shook when he grew angry, and eyes that never quite met those of the people he claimed to own. His wife, Constance Beaumont, shared a name with Solomon's mother, but possessed none of her warmth, existing as a pale ghost who floated through the manor house, dispensing cruelty with the casual indifference of someone swatting flies. Solomon grew into a man of uncommon intelligence and unsettling presence. By the time he reached his 26th year in 1844, he stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of labor, skin the color of rich mahogany, and eyes that seemed to see through the lies white men told themselves about the natural order of things. The other enslaved people on the plantation regarded him with a mixture of respect and wariness, for Solomon possessed a quality that made even the cruelest overseers hesitate before raising their whips. He never cowered, never begged, and when he looked at a white man, there was something in his gaze that suggested he knew secrets about the universe that they could never comprehend. The trouble began in earnest during the spring of 1844, when Master Beaumont's eldest son, William, returned from his studies in New Orleans with ideas about modern plantation management. William was 23, handsome in the way that privileged young men often are, with sandy hair that fell across his forehead and a smile that charmed the daughters of neighboring plantation owners. But beneath that veneer of southern gentility lurked something rotten, a cruelty that manifested in casual violence, and eyes that lingered too long on women who had no power to refuse his attention. William took particular interest in Solomon, perhaps sensing the unspoken defiance that simmered beneath the slave's carefully neutral expression. He began assigning Solomon the most degrading tasks, sending him to clean the outhouses, to slaughter pigs in the sweltering heat, to work in the rice paddies where water moccasins glided between the stalks and disease bred in standing water. Solomon endured it all without complaint, which only seemed to infuriate William further. The young master wanted to break him, to see him grovel, to extract some acknowledgement of absolute power and submission. One particularly brutal afternoon in late June, William ordered Solomon to dig a well in the hard clay soil behind the manor house. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees, and Solomon worked stripped to the waist, his muscles straining as he drove the shovel into earth that seemed determined to resist. William sat in the shade of a magnolia tree, sipping mint juleps and occasionally throwing rocks into the deepening hole, laughing when they struck Solomon's shoulders or back. The other slaves watched from a distance, their faces carefully blank, knowing that any show of sympathy would result in their own punishment. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Solomon struck something hard with his shovel. At first he thought it was a large rock, but as he cleared away the clay, he discovered a box made of tin, sealed with wax, and buried at least 8 feet down. His heart began to pound with a mixture of curiosity and dread. He glanced up at William, who had dozed off in his chair, mouth open and snoring softly. Making a decision that would alter the course of his life, Solomon quickly pried open the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents, letters written in French and English, dated from 1792, detailing the purchase of the Beaumont land from a French colonist named Laurent Moreau. But it wasn't the land transaction that made Solomon's blood run cold. It was the second set of papers beneath, papers that revealed Richard Beaumont's grandfather had never actually completed the purchase. He had murdered Laurent Moreau and his entire family, 7 people, including children, and buried them somewhere on the property. The letters were from Moreau's brother in New Orleans, inquiring about Laurent's welfare. The Beaumont patriarch had apparently kept these as trophies of his crime. Solomon's hands trembled as he held evidence that could destroy the Beaumont family, proof that their entire empire was built on murder and fraud. Louisiana law, corrupt as it was, might still recognize the claims of Moreau's descendants if such evidence came to light. But what could he do with this knowledge? He was a slave with no legal standing, unable to testify in court, possessing information that would guarantee his death if discovered. He heard William stirring above and quickly rewrapped the papers, placing them back in the box. His mind raced. He couldn't leave them here, couldn't let them be discovered by William, but neither could he be caught with them. In a moment of desperate inspiration, he set the box aside in the dirt and covered it with his shirt, then continued digging. When William finally roused himself and demanded to know why the well wasn't finished, Solomon simply pointed to the depth he'd achieved and asked for water. William, satisfied that he'd sufficiently tormented Solomon for one day, wandered back to the house. That night, after the plantation had settled into uneasy sleep, Solomon retrieved the box. He moved through the darkness like smoke, avoiding the patrols that Master Beaumont had instituted after several slaves had attempted to escape the previous year. The documents needed to be hidden somewhere safe, somewhere he could retrieve them if the opportunity ever arose to use them. He thought of the old chapel that stood at the edge of the property, a structure built by French missionaries in the 1700s and now abandoned, its walls covered in vines and its roof partially collapsed. It was considered haunted by both white and black inhabitants of the plantation, a place where strange lights were sometimes seen and stranger sounds heard. Solomon had never feared ghosts. If they existed, they were just more souls trapped by circumstances beyond their control. He made his way through the darkness, the tin box clutched against his chest, moving between the cotton fields where the plants stood in endless rows like soldiers awaiting orders. The moon hung fat and yellow above him, providing just enough light to navigate by. In the distance, he could hear the Mississippi River, that great artery of commerce and misery, flowing endlessly toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying cotton and sugar and the broken dreams of millions. The chapel loomed before him, its stone walls silver in the moonlight. The wooden door had long since rotted away, leaving a black rectangle that seemed to lead into nothing. Solomon hesitated for just a moment, then stepped inside. The interior smelled of damp earth and decay, with moonlight filtering through gaps in the roof to illuminate a floor covered in dead leaves and the debris of years. The altar still stood at the far end, though its cross had fallen long ago. Solomon approached it carefully, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. He knelt before the altar and began to dig into the earthen floor with his bare hands, excavating a hole deep enough to conceal the tin box. As he worked, he became aware of a presence, not threatening, but observant, as if the chapel itself was watching his actions. The air grew heavy, thick with moisture and something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand up. Solomon didn't stop digging. If ghosts existed and if they objected to his presence, let them try to stop him. He had more to fear from the living than the dead. When the hole was deep enough, he placed the box inside and covered it carefully, then scattered leaves and dirt across the surface until no sign of disturbance remained. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard, and spoke into the darkness. His voice was soft but firm, addressing whatever spirits might inhabit this forsaken place. He told them he meant no disrespect, that he was simply a man trying to survive in a world that saw him as property. He asked them to keep his secret, to guard this evidence of old crimes until such time as justice might be possible. A wind rose from nowhere, swirling through the chapel and stirring the leaves into small whirlwinds. Solomon felt, rather than heard a response, a sense of acknowledgement that settled into his bones like certainty. He left the chapel with the strange conviction that he had made a pact with forces beyond his understanding, forces that might prove to be allies in the struggle ahead. The summer of 1844 grew hotter and meaner as the weeks passed. William Beaumont's campaign against Solomon intensified, becoming an obsession that other members of the family began to notice and comment upon. Master Richard pulled his son aside one evening and suggested that perhaps he was paying too much attention to one slave, that such focus was unseemly for a gentleman. William laughed it off, claiming he was simply trying to maximize efficiency, but his eyes betrayed a darker truth. He saw in Solomon everything he feared about the system that gave him power, the intelligence that shouldn't exist in someone deemed inferior, the dignity that couldn't be stripped away by whip or chain, the quiet certainty that all empires eventually fall. Solomon continued his work with mechanical precision, never giving William the satisfaction of visible distress. He rose before dawn, worked through the blazing heat of day, and collapsed onto his pallet at night with muscles screaming and mind churning. He began to pay attention to patterns he had previously ignored. The schedule of patrols, the times when overseers were most drunk and least vigilant, the network of enslaved people who moved between plantations carrying messages and goods. He listened to whispered conversations about escape routes, about friendly Quakers to the north who offered shelter, about ships that might take a man to Canada or Mexico, where slavery had been abolished. But Solomon wasn't planning to run. Not yet. He had unfinished business here, a debt to collect on behalf of Laurent Moreau and his murdered family. The question was how to turn knowledge into action when he had no voice, no standing, no rights under the law that white men recognized. The answer came from an unexpected source. In early August, a traveling preacher arrived at the plantation. Reverend Josiah Crawford was a circuit rider who moved between plantations offering religious instruction to both white families and their enslaved workforce. Master Beaumont, who considered himself a godly man despite his numerous transgressions, welcomed the Reverend enthusiastically. Services were held on Sunday mornings, with white families sitting in the shade of oak trees, while enslaved people stood in the sun, listening to sermons about obedience and accepting one's divinely ordained place in the social order. But Reverend Crawford was not what he appeared to be. Solomon noticed small details that others missed. The way the preacher's eyes lingered on the chains and whips, the slight tremor in his voice when he quoted passages about slavery from Exodus, the careful questions he asked about how enslaved people were treated. On the second Sunday of Crawford's visit, Solomon lingered after the service, pretending to gather fallen branches for firewood. The Reverend approached him, ostensibly to offer a blessing, but spoke in a low voice that only Solomon could hear. Crawford was an abolitionist, affiliated with networks that smuggled escaped slaves to freedom. He moved through the South, gathering intelligence about the locations and security of plantations, identifying people who might be ready to attempt escape, and occasionally helping to coordinate actions that would disrupt the slave economy. He had heard rumors about Solomon Pierce, about a man of unusual bearing and intelligence, who seemed to be waiting for something. Was Solomon interested in freedom? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Solomon's mind raced through possibilities and dangers. Could he trust this white man who spoke in whispers? Was this a trap, a test orchestrated by Master Beaumont to identify potential runaways? But looking into Crawford's eyes, Solomon saw something he rarely encountered in white faces: genuine conviction and moral clarity. He made his decision in an instant, the kind of choice that can only be made when hesitation means death. He told Crawford about the documents, about the murders and fraud that formed the foundation of Beaumont wealth. He explained where they were hidden and suggested that perhaps such evidence, if delivered to the right people in New Orleans, might accomplish more than simply freeing one man. It might bring down an entire criminal empire and call into question the legitimacy of other plantations built on similar sins. Crawford listened with growing amazement, recognizing the explosive potential of what Solomon described. They made a plan, necessarily simple given the constraints. Crawford would leave the plantation as scheduled, traveling to his next appointment at a neighboring estate. But he would detour to New Orleans, carrying a letter from Solomon written in careful script on paper stolen from the manor house. The letter would go to a lawyer named Benjamin Rousseau, a man of mixed race who had bought his own freedom and now dedicated his life to fighting slavery through legal means. Rousseau would know what to do with the information, how to investigate the murders of Laurent Moreau's family, and potentially expose the Beaumont's crime. But there was a problem. Even if the legal strategy worked, even if the Beaumont claim to the land was invalidated, what would happen to the enslaved people? They were considered property, assets to be liquidated if the estate was seized. They could be sold to other masters, families separated, children sent hundreds of miles away to cotton plantations in Mississippi or Alabama. Solomon couldn't accept that outcome. Any plan for justice had to include liberation for his people. All of them. Crawford promised to work on that aspect, to contact his network and see if mass escape could be coordinated with the legal exposure. It would take time, perhaps months, but if they could synchronize their efforts, they might achieve something unprecedented: the simultaneous legal destruction of a plantation and the liberation of its enslaved population. It was audacious to the point of madness. But Solomon had long since given up on modest dreams. As Crawford left the plantation 2 days later, Solomon felt the weight of hope for the first time in years. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope. It made a man vulnerable, gave him something to lose beyond the mere fact of breathing. But it also gave him purpose beyond survival, a reason to endure whatever William Beaumont might dish out while they waited for the wheels of justice to slowly turn. August gave way to September, and the plantation buzzed with preparation for harvest. Cotton bolls burst open like white flowers, and enslaved people moved through the fields with long sacks strapped across their bodies, picking from dawn until the light failed. Quotas were established, 200 pounds per person per day, and those who failed to meet the target faced the lash. Solomon picked cotton with mechanical efficiency, his mind far away, calculating distances and possibilities, imagining a future that didn't include chains. William continued his campaign of petty cruelties, but Solomon noticed a change in his tormentor. William had begun drinking more heavily, often appearing in the fields by midday already half drunk, his commands slurred and increasingly erratic. Rumors circulated among the house servants that William had gambling debts, significant ones, and that his father had refused to pay them. There was talk of violence in New Orleans, of a man William had assaulted at a card game, of threats from people who didn't care about his last name or social position. On a Tuesday evening in late September, as the sun set in a blaze of purple and gold, William came looking for Solomon in a state of rage that terrified even the overseers. He had lost $5,000 in a card game the night before, money he didn't have, and the holder of his notes was demanding immediate payment. William needed someone to blame, someone to punish for his own weakness and stupidity. He found Solomon in the barn, forking hay into the feeding troughs for the horses. What happened next would be recounted in different versions over the years, with each telling adding or subtracting details according to the teller's perspective. What is certain is that William Beaumont came at Solomon with a riding crop, screaming obscenities and accusations that made no sense. He blamed Solomon for his debts, for the contempt he saw in his father's eyes, for the whispers of the other plantation owners' sons who thought him weak. He struck Solomon across the face, then again across the shoulders, working himself into a frenzy. Solomon stood and took the blows without defending himself, knowing that to raise a hand against a white man meant death. But something broke inside him in those moments. Some final restraint that had kept him docile despite the indignities. When William raised the crop for another blow, Solomon caught his wrist. They froze like that, staring at each other, both understanding that a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. William's face went white, then red. He opened his mouth to scream for help, to bring the overseers running with their guns and dogs. Solomon's hand tightened on William's wrist, not hard enough to break bone, but firm enough to prevent the young master from pulling away. He spoke for the first time in their entire encounter. His voice, low and steady, carrying absolute conviction. He told William that he was already a dead man, that his debts would be his ruin, that the life he knew was already over. He said that William could choose to end things here, screaming in a barn, or he could walk away and deal with his actual problems. The choice was his. Something in Solomon's tone, some quality of prophecy rather than threat, penetrated William's alcohol-fogged brain. He jerked his wrist free and stumbled backward, nearly falling over a bale of hay. For a long moment they regarded each other, and then William turned and fled into the gathering darkness. Solomon stood alone in the barn, his heart pounding, knowing he had just signed his own death warrant. Whether it came tonight or tomorrow or next week didn't matter. White men did not forgive being touched by those they deemed inferior. He didn't return to the slave quarters that night. Instead, he made his way through the darkness to the old chapel, moving with the certainty of a man who has nothing left to lose. He retrieved the tin box from its hiding place, brushed the dirt from its surface, and sat with his back against the altar. He opened the box, and by moonlight read the letters again. The evidence of murders 52 years old, crimes that had created this plantation and all its misery. He wondered if Benjamin Rousseau had received Crawford's letter, if any investigation had begun, if anyone in New Orleans gave a damn about dead Frenchmen and the slaves who lived on land built with their bones. The night deepened around him, bringing with it the sounds of the Louisiana wetlands, frogs and insects, and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Solomon felt surprisingly calm, as if he had finally stepped into a role he had been rehearsing for his entire life. Whatever came next, he would face it with dignity. He had spent 26 years being told he was less than human, and he had never believed it. He wouldn't start believing it now. He dozed fitfully as the night wore on, jerking awake at every sound, expecting to hear dogs and men coming to drag him to his punishment. But the night remained quiet, except for the natural sounds of the wilderness. When dawn began to break, Solomon carefully reburied the tin box and made his way back toward the plantation. He would not run. He would not give them the satisfaction of hunting him through the swamps. If judgment was coming, let it come. But judgment arrived in a form no one expected. Solomon had just reached the edge of the fields when he heard shouting from the direction of the main house. Smoke rose into the morning sky, black and thick, carrying the acrid smell of burning wood and hay. The barn where he had confronted William the night before was engulfed in flames, fire climbing the walls and leaping toward the sky, as if eager to escape the earth. People ran in all directions, slaves and overseers alike, shouting for water buckets, for help. for someone to organize the chaos. Master Beaumont stood in his nightshirt, his face purple with rage and fear. The barn housed not just horses and hay, but valuable equipment, saddles and bridles worth hundreds of dollars, tools essential for running the plantation. As Solomon approached, trying to help with the bucket brigade, Beaumont's eyes locked onto him. The accusation came instantly, without evidence or logic, but with the certainty of a man who needed someone to blame. He pointed at Solomon and screamed that he had done this, that he had fired the barn in revenge for some imagined slight. Solomon tried to protest, explaining that he had been in the field since before dawn, but his words meant nothing. William emerged from the house, still drunk from the night before, and added his voice to the accusation. He claimed Solomon had threatened him, had spoken of revenge, had made it clear he meant to destroy the plantation. The other slaves avoided Solomon's eyes, knowing that association with him now meant sharing his fate. Within minutes, Solomon's hands were bound, and he was being dragged toward the root cellar, a stone structure half buried in the earth, where vegetables were stored, and where, occasionally, slaves were locked up pending punishment. Master Beaumont declared that Solomon would be held there until Sheriff Gaines arrived from town to take him to trial. Everyone knew what that meant. There would be no trial. Not really. Solomon would be hanged or burned, made into an example for any other slaves who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. They threw him down the stone steps into the darkness of the cellar and barred the door from outside. Solomon landed hard on the earthen floor, his bound hands making it impossible to break his fall properly. He lay there for a moment, breathing in the smell of potatoes and onions and damp earth, listening to the chaos continuing above. The barn was a loss. That much was clear from the shouting. The fire had spread too quickly, burned too hot, consumed everything before enough water could be brought to fight it. Solomon managed to roll onto his side and then work his way to a sitting position. The cellar was completely dark, except for thin lines of light that crept around the edges of the door. His hands were tied in front of him, which was careless of his captors, but the rope was thick and knotted tight. He began to work at it with his teeth, a slow and painful process, knowing he had hours at best before the sheriff arrived. As he worked, he thought about William's face in the barn the night before, the strange mixture of fear and rage. He thought about the fire itself, how quickly it had spread, how convenient its timing. Solomon had not fired the barn, but someone had. The question was who and why. The obvious answer presented itself. William Beaumont, desperate and drowning in debt, had burned his father's barn and blamed a slave. It would provide distraction from his own problems, maybe even sympathy from creditors. And it would eliminate Solomon, the witness to his humiliation. But would William really be that reckless? The barn was valuable, its loss a genuine blow to the plantation's operations, unless, Solomon realized with growing clarity, unless William planned to burn more than just a barn. If he was desperate enough, if his debts were as catastrophic as rumors suggested, he might burn the entire plantation and disappear with whatever insurance money existed. Blame it all on a rebellious slave, collect the money, and start over somewhere new. The thought chilled Solomon even in the cool darkness of the cellar. If he was right, if William planned more fires, then every enslaved person on the plantation was in danger. They would be locked in their quarters at night, unable to escape if flames came for them. Solomon worked at his bonds with renewed urgency, teeth tearing at the rope fibers, ignoring the pain in his jaw and the taste of hemp and dirt. Hours passed. The chaos above gradually died down as the barn burned itself out, leaving nothing but ash and twisted metal. Solomon could hear people moving around, voices discussing the disaster. Master Beaumont roaring orders about salvaging what could be saved. No one came to check on the prisoner in the root cellar. He had been forgotten in the crisis, which suited Solomon perfectly. By early afternoon, he had managed to loosen the rope enough to squeeze one hand free. The skin was raw and bleeding, but his hands were free. He examined the door to the cellar, a thick wooden structure barred from outside with iron brackets. There was no way to open it from within, no weakness to exploit. The stone walls were solid, built by craftsmen who knew their business. The only other opening was a ventilation shaft, barely 6 inches wide, that ran up through the ceiling to the surface, much too small for a man to squeeze through, but large enough for air and for something else. Solomon could smell smoke again, faint but distinct, different from the lingering odor of the burned barn. This was new smoke, fresh smoke, coming from somewhere upwind. His pulse quickened. He pressed his face to the ventilation shaft and inhaled deeply. The smoke was stronger here, and mixed with it was another scent, one that made his blood run cold. Cotton. Someone had fired the cotton storehouse. The implications crashed over him like a wave. The storehouse contained the entire yield of the plantation's harvest, hundreds of bales of cotton representing the year's profits. Its destruction would be catastrophic for the Beaumont family, potentially ruining them. And if Solomon was locked in the root cellar, unable to have set the fire, his innocence in the barn burning might become apparent, unless, of course, he died in the cellar before anyone thought to question the convenient narrative of the rebellious slave. He heard screaming above, the sound of men running, the same chaos as earlier, but more desperate now. The plantation was in genuine crisis. Solomon pressed himself against the door and shouted, pounding with his fists, demanding to be let out. His voice was hoarse from the smoke that was beginning to filter into the cellar, making his eyes water and his throat burn. No one came. Either they couldn't hear him over the noise of fighting the fire, or they had decided to let him suffocate as a convenient solution to the problem he represented. Solomon looked around the cellar with new eyes, searching for any possibility of escape. The ventilation shaft drew his attention again. It was too narrow for him to climb through, but it represented a connection to the surface, a path for air and smoke, and potentially sound. He cupped his hands around his mouth and began to shout up through the shaft, not calling for help, but calling out something else entirely. He shouted the truth about the documents, about Laurent Moreau and his murdered family, about the fraud that had created the Beaumont plantation. He shouted that the evidence was hidden in the old chapel, that anyone who wanted to know the truth need only look beneath the altar. He shouted that William Beaumont was burning the plantation for insurance money, that he was a gambler and a coward who would let innocent people die to cover his debts. Solomon didn't know if anyone could hear him, didn't know if his words were reaching farther than a few feet beyond the ventilation shaft. but he shouted them anyway because doing something was better than passive acceptance of death. The smoke grew thicker. Solomon pulled his shirt up over his mouth and nose, breathing through the fabric, trying to filter the worst of it. His lungs burned, and his head began to swim. The temperature in the cellar was rising as heat from the fire above seeped through the stone ceiling. He slumped against the wall, still shouting when he could draw enough breath, determined that if he was going to die, he would die speaking truth to power even if power couldn't hear him. Then, impossibly, he heard the sound of the bar being lifted from outside. The door swung open, bringing a rush of fresh air mixed with smoke. Solomon squinted against the sudden light, trying to see who had freed him. The figure was backlit by the flames consuming the storehouse 50 yards away, making identification impossible. But the voice, when it spoke, was familiar. It was Reverend Crawford, returned to the plantation at the worst possible moment, or perhaps the best. He had been traveling back through the area and had seen the smoke from miles away. When he arrived at the plantation, he found it in chaos, with the white family focused entirely on trying to save the storehouse. Crawford had quietly asked where Solomon was being held, and, when told, had simply walked to the root cellar and opened it. In the confusion, no one had noticed or cared. Crawford pulled Solomon from the cellar, half carrying him away from the flames. They stumbled toward the tree line, coughing and gasping. Behind them, the storehouse groaned and collapsed inward, sending up a fountain of sparks that looked like fireflies ascending to heaven. Solomon's legs gave out when they reached the relative safety of the trees, and he collapsed onto pine needles and leaf litter, dragging air into his starved lungs. Crawford knelt beside him, speaking urgently. He had been to New Orleans, had delivered Solomon's letter to Benjamin Rousseau, had set wheels in motion that could not now be stopped, but it would take weeks, maybe months, for legal proceedings to advance. Rousseau was investigating, interviewing people who might have known Laurent Moreau, searching for living descendants who could make a claim. The case was strong, Crawford said, but justice moved slowly, while masters moved fast. Solomon knew what Crawford was suggesting without the words being spoken. He had to run, had to escape now while the plantation burned and chaos reigned. If he stayed, he would hang for crimes he didn't commit. But looking back at the fires, at the enslaved people fighting desperately to save their master's property, Solomon felt the weight of responsibility. He couldn't run alone, couldn't leave them to face whatever madness William Beaumont had unleashed. He told Crawford about his suspicions, about William's debts and desperation, about the convenient timing of fires. Crawford's face grew grim as understanding dawned. If Solomon was right, William might very well burn the slave quarters next, killing 200 people in their sleep and blaming it on the same rebellious slave who had supposedly fired the barn and storehouse. It would be perfectly in keeping with the logic of slavery, where enslaved lives mattered less than property and could be disposed of to serve a narrative. They needed to warn the others, needed to evacuate the quarters before William's madness claimed more victims. But how? Master Beaumont and his overseers were armed and on alert. Any attempt to organize a mass movement of enslaved people would be seen as revolt and met with gunfire. Solomon and Crawford exchanged a look that communicated volumes. They were trapped between impossible choices, each path leading toward tragedy. The decision was made for them by the wind. It shifted suddenly, blowing from the southwest, carrying sparks from the burning storehouse toward the main house. Within minutes, the manor house's roof caught fire, flames racing along the old wooden shingles like eager children playing a game. The White family erupted from the house in various states of undress, carrying whatever valuables they could grab. Master Beaumont stood in his yard watching his empire burn, his face a mask of incomprehension. In the chaos, Solomon and Crawford made their move. They ran toward the slave quarters, shouting for everyone to get out, to run for the trees, that the whole plantation was burning. Some needed no convincing. Others hesitated, afraid that leaving the quarters without permission would result in punishment worse than fire. Solomon physically pulled people from their homes, Crawford doing the same, both men knowing that every second counted. William Beaumont appeared through the smoke like an avenging demon, a pistol in his hand and murder in his eyes. He had seen Solomon, seen the escaped prisoner trying to organize the slaves, and his rage overwhelmed whatever rationality remained in his alcohol-soaked brain. He raised the pistol and fired, the shot going wide as smoke obscured his vision. He fired again, and this time Crawford cried out, clutching his shoulder as blood blossomed through his shirt. Solomon didn't think. He charged at William, covering the distance between them in seconds, hitting the young master like a freight train and driving him to the ground. The pistol flew from William's hand and disappeared into the smoke. They grappled in the dirt, William screaming curses and Solomon silent, except for his labored breathing. Around them, the plantation continued to burn, the work of generations consumed by flames that asked no permission and respected no hierarchy. Solomon's hands found William's throat. He could feel the pulse beneath his thumbs, feel the cartilage of the windpipe, feel the power to end a life. One squeeze, one moment of applied pressure, and William Beaumont would be gone. All the cruelty, all the petty violence, all the casual evil would stop. Solomon had wanted this, had dreamed of this moment in the depths of countless nights. But now, with the power literally in his hands, he found he couldn't do it. He released William and rolled away, coming to his feet with effort. William gasped and coughed, clutching his throat, tears streaming down his smoke-stained face. Solomon looked at him with something that might have been pity. William was already destroyed, already ruined by his own choices. Killing him would change nothing, would make Solomon a murderer, and confirm everything white society believed about enslaved people. He turned away and ran back toward Crawford, who had staggered to his feet with one hand pressed to his wounded shoulder. Together they herded the last of the slaves away from the quarters, away from the fires, toward the relative safety of the trees. Behind them, the Beaumont plantation burned like a vision of hell, flames reaching toward a sky that was turning black with smoke. They regrouped a quarter-mile away, in a clearing beside a stream where the air was clearer and the heat less intense. Solomon counted heads, relief flooding through him when he realized everyone had made it out. 200 people, scared and confused, looking to him for guidance, even though he had no more idea than they did what came next. Crawford's shoulder was bleeding badly, and several women tore strips from their dresses to bind the wound. As night fell, they watched the fires burn. By midnight, there was nothing left of the Beaumont plantation except ash and a few stone structures that the flames couldn't consume. Solomon knew they couldn't stay here, knew that sunrise would bring authorities, would bring questions and accusations, and quite possibly violence. He gathered everyone together and explained the situation, told them about the documents and Benjamin Rousseau and the case for fraud. He told them that Master Beaumont was ruined, that the plantation was destroyed, but that didn't necessarily mean they were free. Louisiana law would still consider them property, assets to be liquidated to pay debts. But, Solomon continued, speaking with a conviction he didn't entirely feel, if they scattered now, disappeared into the night and made their way north, using the underground railroad networks that Crawford could connect them with, they might achieve a freedom that no law would ever grant them willingly. It was a massive risk, a decision that could result in death for anyone caught, but staying meant going back into chains. And everyone in that clearing had just watched their prison burn. The choice seemed obvious. They split into smaller groups, Crawford providing names and directions to safe houses and sympathetic souls who would offer shelter and passage. Some people went north toward Arkansas and Missouri, others east toward Mississippi, a few south toward the ports of New Orleans, where free people of color might help them find passage on ships bound for Mexico or the Caribbean. Solomon's group consisted of 30 people, mostly field hands and skilled workers who had been with the plantation for years. Before they left, Solomon made one final trip back to the ruins. The old chapel stood untouched by the flames, its stone walls eternal and patient. He retrieved the tin box for the last time and brought it back to Crawford. If the Reverend made it to New Orleans, if he survived his wound, he was to give this evidence to Benjamin Rousseau directly. Let the lawyer expose the Beaumont's original sin. Let the truth come out, even if it came too late to matter for the people who had suffered under that sin's consequences, Crawford promised, gripping Solomon's hand with his uninjured arm. He said Solomon was the bravest man he had ever met, regardless of color, regardless of social position. Solomon shook his head, saying that he wasn't brave, he was just tired of being afraid. There was a difference, one that white men might never understand. They parted as dawn broke, Crawford heading toward New Orleans with several younger people to help him travel despite his wound, Solomon's group moving into the bayous and wetlands that sprawled between the plantation and the Mississippi River. The terrain was brutal, thick with mosquitoes and leeches, with water moccasins gliding through water that never quite knew if it wanted to be liquid or solid ground. But Solomon had spent his entire life on this land, knew its moods and rhythms, and guided his people through with the certainty of someone following a map only he could read. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in stands of cypress trees that grew so thick the sun never reached the ground. Solomon's feet, calloused from years of barefoot labor, left prints in the soft mud, prints that filled with water almost as quickly as they were made, erasing evidence of their passage. He thought about the reports that would surely circulate once word spread of the plantation's destruction, about the stories that would be told to explain the impossible disappearance of 200 slaves into the Louisiana wilderness. He wondered if anyone would believe the truth, or if they would invent something more dramatic, more in keeping with the mythology that white society told itself about the people they enslaved. On the third night, they reached the Mississippi River at a point where the banks were low and the current relatively gentle. A barge was waiting, operated by a German immigrant named Klaus Hoffmann, who had become an abolitionist after witnessing a slave auction in New Orleans. Hoffmann ferried them across the river in groups of 10, his barge cutting through the black water like a knife through silk. On the far side lay Arkansas, Slave territory still, but with fewer plantations and more wilderness, with caves and mountains where people could hide and rest before pushing further north. Solomon was in the last group to cross. As the barge reached the far shore and he stepped onto Arkansas soil, he looked back at Louisiana one final time. Smoke still rose from the direction of the Beaumont plantation, visible as a gray smudge against the dawn sky. He wondered if Master Beaumont was still standing in his yard, watching his life burn, understanding finally that all power is temporary and all empires built on cruelty eventually consume themselves. The journey north took weeks. They moved through Arkansas into Missouri, following routes that Crawford had described, relying on the kindness of Quakers and free black communities who offered food and shelter despite the risks. People fell away from the group in small numbers, some deciding to settle in communities along the way, others finding family they had been separated from years before. Solomon didn't try to hold them together, understanding that freedom meant the right to choose your own path. By the time October turned to November, Solomon's group had dwindled to 12 people, all of them determined to reach Canada, where British law recognized no distinction between free and enslaved. They crossed into Illinois, heading for Chicago, where abolitionists operated with relative openness. It was in Chicago that Solomon heard news that made his heart stop. The Beaumont plantation case had exploded in Louisiana courts. Benjamin Rousseau, armed with the documents Solomon had hidden and testimony from Reverend Crawford, had brought charges of fraud and murder against the Beaumont family. The case was sensational, involving wealthy plantation owners, crimes dating back 5 decades, and the destruction of an entire estate. Newspapers across the South covered the story, some defending the Beaumonts as victims of abolitionist conspiracy, others demanding investigation into how many other plantations might be built on similar foundations of murder. Master Richard Beaumont had been arrested, though he claimed complete ignorance of his grandfather's crimes. William Beaumont had disappeared entirely, last seen riding away from the ruins of the plantation on the night of the fires. Warrants had been issued for his arrest on suspicion of arson and attempted murder, but no one could locate him. Some said he had fled to Texas, others that he had been seen in New Orleans gambling dens, still others that he was dead by his own hand or at the hands of creditors he couldn't pay. Most remarkably, the court had ruled that the Beaumont claim to the land was indeed fraudulent, that descendants of Laurent Moreau had rightful ownership. This meant that the people who had been enslaved on that plantation were not legally property of the Beaumonts and arguably never had been. The ruling was narrow, applying only to this specific case, and it didn't make them free in the eyes of Louisiana law. But it created a crack in the legal foundation of slavery itself, a precedent that abolitionists would cite for years to come. Solomon read the newspaper accounts with trembling hands. He had done it, had struck a blow against the system that had claimed ownership of his body and soul. It wasn't enough, wouldn't be enough until every chain was broken and every auction block torn down. But it was something. It was proof that enslaved people were not powerless, that intelligence and courage could challenge even the most entrenched evil. His group reached Canada in mid-November, crossing the border into Ontario on a day when snow fell softly from gray skies. Solomon stood on free soil for the first time in his life and felt something inside him release, some tight knot of constant vigilance that he had carried for 26 years. He wasn't property here. If someone tried to drag him back across the border, Canadian authorities would intervene. It was a limited freedom, circumscribed by poverty and the challenges of building a new life in a foreign country, but it was freedom nonetheless. He settled in a small community of formerly enslaved people outside Toronto, finding work as a carpenter and builder. His intelligence and literacy made him a valuable member of the community, and he eventually opened a school for children, teaching them to read and write with the same careful secrecy his father had taught him. Though here, there was no need for secrecy. Education was a right, not a crime. Over the years, Solomon maintained contact with Reverend Crawford, who had survived his wound and continued his abolitionist work with renewed fervor. Crawford wrote letters describing the ongoing fallout from the Beaumont case, how it had inspired other investigations, how enslaved people in Louisiana and neighboring states had begun to whisper about the man who had walked through fire and emerged free. The story had taken on mythic proportions, as stories often do when they touch something deep in the human need for heroes and hope. Some versions said Solomon had started the fires himself, that he had walked through the flames without being touched, that his footprints in the ash had glowed with supernatural light. Others claimed he had made a pact with the spirits of the old chapel, trading his mortal soul for the power to destroy his oppressors. Still others insisted he had died in the fires, and that the man who had led 200 people to freedom was actually a ghost, a spirit of vengeance who would return whenever enslaved people needed him. Solomon found these stories amusing and sad in equal measure. The truth, he thought, was more remarkable than any fiction. He hadn't walked through fire. He had simply refused to burn. He hadn't made deals with spirits, though he had made peace with forces beyond his understanding. He wasn't a ghost or a saint, just a man who had decided that some things were worth risking everything for, who had understood that death in pursuit of freedom was preferable to life in chains. The years passed. The Civil War came, brutal and transformative, tearing the nation apart and then stitching it back together in a new configuration that at least nominally recognized the humanity of all people. Solomon was 47 when news reached him that slavery had been abolished, that the 13th Amendment had passed, that no person in the United States could be considered property anymore. He wept that day, tears for those who hadn't lived to see it, for parents and grandparents who had died in bondage, for children who had been sold away from their families, for all the countless souls who had suffered under a system that had finally been destroyed. He returned to Louisiana in 1871, an old man now by the standards of the time, hair graying and face weathered by years of labor and Canadian winters. He wanted to see the land where he had been born, wanted to walk once more through places that held so many memories, both terrible and precious. The Beaumont plantation was gone, the land divided and sold to various owners. The manor house had been rebuilt by someone else, the fields planted with different crops, the slave quarters torn down and replaced with tenant houses. It was as if the past had been erased, painted over with new stories that had no connection to what had come before. But the old chapel still stood, its stone walls defiant against time and weather. Solomon made his way there on a spring afternoon when the air was thick with humidity and the smell of jasmine. He stepped inside, noting that someone had cleared away the debris, that the floor had been swept clean. The altar remained, patient as always, holding its secrets. He knelt where he had knelt 27 years before and dug into the earth with his bare hands. The hole he had made was long since filled, but he dug anyway, needing to confirm that the hiding place still existed. He found nothing. Crawford had retrieved the box, had delivered it to Benjamin Rousseau, just as promised, but the hole itself remained, a small cavity in the earth that had once held evidence of old crimes and new hopes. Solomon sat back and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of years and distance. He thought about all the people who had walked this path with him, some dead now, others scattered across the continent, all of them carrying the story of the plantation that burned and the man who refused to burn with it. He wondered if his footprints were still visible somewhere, if the ash of those fires had preserved some trace of his passage. When he emerged from the chapel, he found a group of black children playing in the yard, children born free under Louisiana sun that had once witnessed so much suffering. They stopped their game and stared at him. This tall stranger, with gray in his hair and distant eyes, one of the girls, braver than the others, approached and asked who he was. Solomon smiled at her, seeing in her face the future that he and so many others had fought for. He told her his name and told her that he had once lived here, a long time ago, when the world was different. The girl asked if he was the one from the stories, the man who walked through fire. Solomon laughed and said that he was just a man, but yes, he had been there that night, had seen things he would never forget. The children gathered around him, begging for the story, hungry for tales that connected them to a past their parents often didn't want to discuss. Solomon hesitated, then began to speak. He told them about the plantation, about slavery and injustice, about how human beings had been bought and sold like cattle. He told them about the fires and the escape, about 200 people walking into the wilderness because bondage was worse than any uncertainty. But he also told them about courage and intelligence, about how enslaved people had never been the helpless victims that history sometimes portrayed. They had resisted in 1,000 ways, large and small, preserving their humanity against a system designed to destroy it. They had maintained culture and family despite laws that denied them both. They had educated themselves in secret, had planned rebellions and escapes, had sabotaged the machinery of slavery at every opportunity. The fires of that November night were just one moment in a much longer story of resistance. As the sun set, painting the Louisiana sky in shades of red and orange that reminded him too much of flames, Solomon said goodbye to the children and began the walk back to town. His feet left prints in the dust of the road, prints that would be erased by the next rain, forgotten by the next traveler. But for now they were visible, clear evidence that he had passed this way, that he existed, that his story was real. Solomon Pierce lived another 15 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1886 at the age of 68. By then he was a respected elder in the black community of Toronto, a man whose advice was sought on matters both practical and philosophical. He had married, raised children who had never known slavery, and seen the world change in ways he could never have imagined in that root cellar in 1844. His obituary in the Toronto newspaper made brief mention of his origins in Louisiana, of his escape from slavery, but said nothing about fires or footprints or supernatural powers, just a simple statement that he had been born into bondage and died free, and that in between he had lived with dignity and purpose. It was, perhaps the greatest compliment anyone could pay. But in Louisiana, the stories persisted and grew. Every time a plantation burned under mysterious circumstances, people whispered about Solomon Pierce. Every time a slave escaped and couldn't be found, trackers would sometimes report finding barefoot prints that stopped abruptly at tree lines, as if the runner had simply vanished into air. The legend became something separate from the man, taking on life of its own, serving purposes that Solomon himself might not have recognized or endorsed. Some said his spirit still walked the Louisiana night, helping those who sought freedom, punishing those who dealt in cruelty. Others claimed that on certain foggy mornings, you could see footprints appearing in the ash of old fire sites, visible for just a moment before fading away. Still others insisted that the old chapel was haunted by benevolent ghosts, that enslaved people who prayed there would receive guidance and protection. Solomon would have laughed at these stories, would have insisted that the only magic he had ever possessed was literacy and determination, and a willingness to risk everything. But legends, once born, follow their own logic and serve their own needs. In a time and place where hope was scarce, people needed to believe in something larger than themselves, needed to believe that the cruel system they suffered under was not eternal, that resistance was possible and freedom achievable. The truth was both simpler and more profound than any legend. Solomon Pierce was a man who refused to accept the definition of humanity that slavery imposed, who recognized that all people possessed inherent worth regardless of what laws and customs claimed, who understood that justice delayed was not justice denied, but merely justice waiting for the right moment to manifest. He was brave not because he was fearless, but because he acted despite fear, intelligent not because he possessed formal education, but because he observed carefully and thought deeply about what he observed. His legacy was not footprints in ash or supernatural powers, but the example he set for others. The 12 people who crossed into Canada with him went on to build lives and raise families, and they told his story to their children. Those children told it to their children, and the story spread like ripples in a pond, touching lives that Solomon would never know existed. Some of those descendants became teachers and activists, carrying forward the work he had begun. Others became simply good people trying to live decent lives, which was perhaps its own form of activism in a world still struggling with the legacy of slavery. The Beaumont case continued to reverberate through legal circles for decades. Benjamin Rousseau used it as precedent in other cases, challenging the legitimacy of land claims based on fraud and violence. He didn't win all his cases, didn't even win most of them, but he won enough to establish that the foundations of Southern wealth were not as solid as they appeared. Other lawyers took up similar causes, chipping away at the legal structures that had enabled slavery and its aftermath. Reverend Josiah Crawford continued his circuit riding until arthritis made travel impossible, then settled in Philadelphia, where he wrote a memoir about his experiences helping enslaved people escape. The memoir included a chapter about Solomon Pierce, carefully disguising some details to protect people who might still face danger, but making clear the essential truth that enslaved people had been the primary agents of their own liberation, that white abolitionists like himself had merely provided support for black courage and intelligence. The old chapel in Louisiana eventually fell into complete ruin, its stones scattered by treasure hunters who believed that anything connected to the legend of Solomon Pierce must contain hidden wealth. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find except the memory of a man who had knelt in darkness and buried evidence of crimes he couldn't personally avenge. But memory, it turns out, is worth more than gold, more durable than stone, more powerful than any empire built on human suffering. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find traces of the Beaumont plantation. The land has been parceled and sold and developed, but the bones of the past remain just beneath the surface. Archaeologists have excavated the foundations of the slave quarters, finding artifacts that speak to the humanity of the people who lived there. Buttons and beads and fragments of pottery that indicate lives lived with dignity despite circumstances designed to strip dignity away. These artifacts rest in museums now, bearing silent witness to what was endured and what was overcome. And sometimes, in certain lights, on certain days, you can see patterns in the soil of Louisiana fields that might be old foundations, or might be something else entirely. Barefoot prints, perhaps, preserved by some quirk of geology or chemistry, leading from nowhere to nowhere, suggesting movement and purpose and the eternal human drive toward freedom. Whether they're real or imagined doesn't matter. What matters is what they represent. The journey of one man and 200 others who decided that death was preferable to bondage and that the future, however uncertain, was worth fighting for. Solomon Pierce walked through fire, not because he was immune to flames, but because he understood that remaining in the cellar meant burning anyway. He left footprints of ash not through magic but through the simple act of moving forward when others expected him to stay still. And in doing so, he created a path that others could follow, a map written in courage and determination, and the refusal to accept that some people are born to be free while others are born to serve. His story is not finished because the work he began is not finished. The legacy of slavery persists in poverty and inequality, in systems designed to favor some and hinder others, in the ongoing struggle to make real the promise that all people are created equal. But his story reminds us that change is possible, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, that no injustice is so entrenched that it cannot be challenged and eventually overcome. So when you hear thunder on hot Louisiana nights, or smell smoke where no fire burns, or see patterns in the ash that suggest human passage, think of Solomon Pierce. Think of a man who decided that freedom was worth any risk, who proved that intelligence and courage can challenge any tyranny, who left footprints that still guide people toward a better world. His body returned to earth over a century ago, but his spirit, the part of him that refused to accept bondage, that part walks still, leaving traces for those with eyes to see and hearts brave enough to follow.